In about 1892, a woman of about 70 carried a box down the back stairs of Uppark for the last time. She had run that house since 1880 until her hearing failed and the rheumatism took her knees. She had no pension, because no domestic servant in Britain had a right to one. She had no home, because the room had always belonged to her employer. One thing kept Sarah Wells out of the workhouse: a son who could afford to take her in, and the system had arranged nothing at all for the women who had nobody. If you want the history the guidebooks leave out, subscribe and stay with me. The cruelest part of this system was never the dismissal, and it takes the whole story to see it. Chapter 1. Nobody wrote down where they went. The census of 1891 counted 1.5 million servants in Britain, and almost none of their endings. The exact figure is worth hearing in full, because it is easy to lose the scale of this thing inside a phrase like domestic service. In 1891, 1,444,694 people in Britain were returned as indoor domestic servants. 1,386,167 of them were women. No other occupation in the country employed as many people. For women, no other occupation came close, and had not come close for 20 years. By 1871, service was already the largest single employer of women in Britain, and it held that position for the rest of the Victorian age. So this story belongs to the largest working population in the country. And the record does something strange with them. It is enormous at one end and empty at the other. A great house kept accounts. It kept wage books, household books, inventories, letters, estate papers. It recorded what a housemaid was paid to the shilling, what she was allowed for sugar, the day she arrived, and sometimes the day she left. The family who owned the house is documented from birth to burial, in wills, in the newspapers, in the memoirs of their friends. A researcher can follow a duke through 60 years of his life without difficulty. Follow the woman who lit his fires, and the trail stops at the door. The wage book records her last payment. After that, in the overwhelming majority of cases, there is nothing. No note of where she went, no forwarding address, no mention in any letter. She served for 30 years in a house that wrote everything down, and the house did not write down what became of her. That silence follows the same principle that built the back stairs. These houses were designed so that the work would never be seen. Servants used their own corridors and their own staircases. In the strictest households, a maid who met a member of the family in a passage was expected to stand aside and face the wall until they had gone. An entire architecture of concealed doors and hidden passages existed so that coal, water, food, and laundry could move through a building without anybody noticing the hands that moved them. A workforce built to be invisible left no visible trace when it stopped. There is one instrument that catches these people, and it is the census. Every 10 years, the state went house to house and wrote down who was living where and what they did. Because it counted everybody, it counted the ones nobody else recorded. Read those returns, and one word starts to repeat. Formerly. Formerly a domestic servant. Formerly a laundress. Formerly a charwoman, which was the period term for a woman who came in by the day to do rough cleaning. Agricultural labourers, general labourers, domestic servants, laundresses and charwomen were the people most likely to be written down as formerly something, or, with no softening at all, as paupers. That single word is the administrative headstone for a very large number of working lives. It does not say where she lived. It does not say who fed her. It says only that the work had stopped and that nothing had replaced it. The other thing the census shows is how late the work ran. In Victorian England, 33% of women over the age of 65 were still working. Among men, the figure was far higher, at 88% of all men still in employment. These were not people easing into a comfortable half-retirement. In Plympton, in the county of Devon, the census caught a woman named Priscilla Abbott, still working as a domestic helper at the age of 85. 85. Still cleaning other people's rooms. Retirement, in the modern sense, existed for a narrow band of people, those who had inherited money or accumulated enough of it to stop. It did not exist for the housemaid. There was no state pension in Britain of any kind until 1908, and the first payments did not reach anybody until January of 1909. Before that date, a working person's old age was funded by savings, by family, by charity, by the poor law, or by continuing to work until the body refused. For most of the people in this story, it was the last of those, followed by one of the others. The question this whole film exists to answer is a simple one, and it has been surprisingly hard to ask. What actually happened to a woman who had given a great house 40 years of her life, on the morning she could no longer climb the stairs? The answer begins with a fact so ordinary that almost nobody notices what it means. She had nowhere to go home to, because she had never had a home to go to at all. Chapter 2. The job came with the bed. A servant did not go home from work because the work and the home were the same building and both belonged to somebody else. Service in a great house was living in service. The servant slept under the employer's roof, ate the employer's food, and in many houses wore clothing bought with the employer's allowance. Female servants were quartered in the attics, under the roof, up the last flight of the back stairs. Male servants were often put in the basement, near the plate room where the silver was kept, or out over the stables. The two were separated deliberately, by staircase and by corridor, so that they could not reach each other in the night. The rooms were small. Beds were often shared. There was a washstand, a chest, and the servants' own possessions, and there was rarely any heating at all, in a house where the whole business of the day was carrying warmth to other people. Everything a housemaid owned in the world fitted into the box at the end of her bed, and the arrangement took her whole world with it. A servant's colleagues lived in the same attics. Her meals were taken at the servants' hall table with the same people every day for years. Her standing, her friendships, and her routine were all held inside one building, so a woman who left a place did not simply lose an income. She lost the entire society she lived in on the same afternoon. She spent her days among objects of enormous value. Silver she cleaned by hand, porcelain she carried, furniture she polished, in rooms hung with paintings. None of it was hers, and the room she slept in belonged to the family as well. That is the fact that makes the ending of a service career so brutal. The wage, the roof, the meals, and the social standing were a single package, arriving together on the day of hiring and leaving together on the day of dismissal. A servant sent away in the morning had, by the afternoon, lost her income, her address, her food, and her position in the world. There was no notice period in housing terms because there was no tenancy. There was no accumulated claim on the room, however many years she had slept in it. The bed went with the job, and the job could end at the employer's word. Now the money. At Chatsworth in Derbyshire, the seat of the Dukes of Devonshire and one of the richest households in the country, a survey of the household in 1811 recorded the housemaids earning £11 each a year, with a small allowance for sugar worth roughly £3 on top. When the 6th Duke inherited, he raised the wages of all his staff, and the housemaids went to £15. Chatsworth's own archive is clear that this was generous by the standards of the time. A maid in a less wealthy household might hope for £8 a year. Across the Victorian period, a general servant, the single maid of all work in a modest home, is recorded at about £16 a year. At the very top of a great household, the money was different in kind. A butler at Manderston in 1905 earned £60. So the spread inside a great house ran from roughly £8 a year at the bottom to 60 at the top, and the great majority of the workforce sat at the bottom of that range. Board and lodging were provided, and this is the fact that makes the arithmetic look kinder than it was. In principle, a servant's cash wage was almost entirely savable, since the food and the bed cost her nothing. In practice, it went. It went on clothing and uniform, on boots, on the fare to a new place when she moved, on money sent home to parents and younger brothers and sisters. In the upper ranks, it went on looking the part, because a housekeeper or a lady's maid had to appear in front of the family and could not do it in a worn dress. The deeper problem lay in the shape of the wage, rather than its size. The wage was a payment for the present, with no future component in it whatever. Nothing was withheld, no fund accrued, no entitlement grew with length of service. There was no scheme, no contribution, no deferred portion held back against the day the work stopped. 40 years in one house produced exactly the same entitlement as 4 months, which was none. That is the entire mechanism of this film, stated in a single line, and every case that follows is an illustration of it. The bargain the great houses offered was food, shelter, wages, and a place in a hierarchy, for as long as the body could do the work, and not 1 hour longer. Which raises an obvious question, and the answer to it is more interesting than it looks. If the ending was that bare, why did anybody stay? Chapter 3. The ladder that led to nothing. The system offered a girl of 14 a genuine climb from scullery to kitchen to the housekeeper's own parlour, and then it offered nothing above it. It has to be said plainly, because a film about the cruelty of this system is worthless if it pretends the system had nothing to offer. It had a great deal to offer, and that is precisely why 1.5 million people were inside it. A great house at full establishment ran a hierarchy as formal as a regiment. At the top of the indoor staff stood the house steward or the butler, and on the female side, the housekeeper. Below them came the valet, who dressed and attended the master, and the lady's maid, who did the same for the mistress. Then the cook, then the footman and the under-butler, then the housemaids, the kitchen maids, the laundry maids, and the still room maids. The still room being the pantry where preserves, cordials, and the finer breakfast items were made. At the bottom stood the scullery maid, who washed what everybody else had used, and the hall boy, who was often barely a boy at all. Outdoors, the hierarchy ran again, through the head gardener and his under-gardeners, the coachman and his grooms, the gamekeepers, and the labourers of the estate. To an American ear, the ranks can sound like decoration. They were a career structure, and they were real. A girl who entered at 14 as a scullery maid could rise, through kitchen maid to cook, through housemaid to head housemaid to housekeeper. A housekeeper in a ducal house held genuine authority over a large staff and a large budget, and she was the senior woman running the whole domestic side of the establishment. She also had things that most working-class families in Victorian Britain did not have at all. Board and lodging, in an era when both were precarious for working people. A dry roof over her head every night of the year, and in the richest houses, as at Chatsworth, wages above the going rate for the work. Set that against the alternatives available to a girl from a labouring family in 1860, and service was frequently the best offer she was ever going to get. The climb was slow, and it was real. Years in a scullery, years as an under-housemaid, a move to a bigger house for a better place, then another. And the character, the written reference from her last employer, carried her from each rung to the next, which is a thread this film will follow shortly, because in the end, it is the thread that hangs everybody. The late Victorian decades were the peak of it all. The 1880s and 1890s were the years when the machine ran hardest and looked most magnificent from the outside. The rhythm of the year was fixed. The London season, meaning the months when the aristocracy gathered in town for parliament and parties, emptied the country houses of their families and filled the London ones. Then came the return, the shooting weeks in the autumn, the house parties, the dinners of many courses. Guests arrived with their own servants, who had to be housed and fed alongside the household's own. Bedrooms were prepared for people who might not use them. Fires were lit in rooms that stood empty for hours, because a cold room was an embarrassment, and warmth was the visible proof of money. Every one of those fires was a scuttle of coal carried up a back staircase by a woman who had risen before anybody else in the building. The guests made it heavier still. A visiting family brought its own servants, a valet, a lady's maid, sometimes more. And every one of them had to be housed in the attics, fed in the hall, and worked around. A house party did not add work in proportion to its guests. It multiplied it. At its height, this was the largest occupation in the country, employing more people than the mills or the mines, and its workers were the only ones expected to be unseen while they did it. The shape of the thing matters more than any single event in it. The ladder was genuine. Every rung of it was reachable. A clever, strong, fortunate girl could climb from the scullery to the housekeeper's parlour in 20 years, and some of them did. And then the ladder simply stopped. There was nothing above the top rung. No pension, no cottage by right, no fund, no title to anything at all. A housekeeper of 65 who had run a great household for a decade stood in exactly the same legal position as the kitchen maid she had hired the previous spring. Everything after this point in the story is about what happened when a body reached the top of that ladder and could no longer stand on it. And the first thing that failed was never the loyalty and never the willingness. It was the knees. Chapter 4. The work wore the body out first. Coal went up the back stairs by hand, water went up beside it, and every grate in the house was cleaned on somebody's knees. Begin with the first hour of the day, because everything else follows from it. The lower servants rose before the household. Their first task was fire. In a great house, the fires had to be laid and lit before anybody of consequence was awake, so that the rooms would be warm when they came down and the water would be hot when they wanted it. That meant coal, and coal did not move itself. It was carried in scuttles, up the back staircase, floor by floor, into bedrooms and dressing rooms and reception rooms, by young women in the dark. Where there was no plumbing, water was carried the same way. Hot water for washing, hot water for baths, carried up in cans and carried down again, cold. Then the grates. A grate was black-leaded, which meant polishing the iron with a graphite paste, by hand, kneeling on the hearth. Every fireplace, every day, in a house full of them. And all of it had to be finished before the family came down, because the entire performance depended on the work appearing to have happened by itself. A room was supposed to be warm on arrival, as though warmth were a property of the house. The hands were meant to be invisible. The instrument that governed the rest of the day hung on a wall in the service passage, the bellboard. A bellboard was a row of bells, each wired to a room, each labelled. A visitor in a bedroom pulled a cord, and a bell moved in the basement, and a servant read the label and went. Speaking tubes did the same work by voice in some houses, a brass mouthpiece in one room connected to another 2 floors below. The effect of both was the same. A person on an upper floor could summon a person from a lower floor at any hour, without moving, without notice, and without needing a reason. So the work had no shape a body could plan around. There was the fixed labour of fires and floors and meals, and then there was the bell, which could go at any moment and had to be answered at a run. Then the floors, also on the knees, with a brush and a bucket. Then the copper and the silver, cleaned by hand with abrasive powders that took the skin off the fingers before they took the tarnish off the metal. Then the laundry, which in a large house was a world of its own. Sheets and tablecloths soaked in tubs, lifted out sodden, wrung, fed through a mangle, hung, dried, and pressed with irons heated on a stove. Wet linen is heavy in a way that has no modern equivalent in domestic life. A woman doing laundry work spent her day lifting weight at arm's length and standing still while she did it. Now add the distances, because this is where the architecture becomes an instrument of wear. In the great houses, the service rooms were deliberately placed at a remove from the family rooms. The kitchen, the sculleries, the larders, the still room and the laundry sat in their own wing or their own basement, often a considerable walk from the dining room and further still from the bedrooms. The reason was partly smell, partly noise, partly fire, and largely the principle that the machinery of the household should not be encountered. The consequence was that every meal, every scuttle of coal, every can of hot water, and every armful of linen crossed that distance on foot, several times a day, for a working lifetime. Nobody measured it at the time. Nobody thought of a housemaid's day as a distance to be counted. But a woman who spent 30 years walking service corridors and climbing back stairs with weight in her hands was doing something to her body that no wage ever accounted for. And the body kept the record that the household did not. The conditions that ended service careers appear again and again in what survives of these lives. And they are exactly the conditions the work produced. Rheumatism, meaning the chronic joint pain and stiffness that Victorians grouped under that name, from years of cold rooms, wet floors, and kneeling, ruined knees, damaged backs, from lifting, failing sight, from close work done by candle and lamp in poor light, mending and sewing and accounts kept in bad rooms, and deafness, which will matter enormously in the story of one particular housekeeper. This is why old age in service was a disqualification rather than an inconvenience. An aging clerk can go on writing. An aging shopkeeper can go on selling. What a servant sold was the physical capacity to carry, kneel, scrub, lift, and stand for long hours. And when that capacity went, there was nothing else in the package to sell. It is worth remembering what a labour market of this kind rewards. Employers advertising for housemaids and kitchen staff specified young women, and said so openly. Physical capability was an explicit hiring criterion. So was appearance at the visible end of the household, where footmen were selected and paid by height and matched for looks like a pair of carriage horses. Into that market, at 60 or 65, walked women who had given their strength to one house and had nothing left to advertise. They were competing with 19-year-olds for work defined by stamina, and the day did not end with the light. The last duties of a great house belonged to the evening, long after the morning fires had gone cold. Rooms had to be made ready for the night. Water had to go up again. The woman who closed the house down was the same one who would be lighting its first fire a few hours later. A working life shaped like that does not produce a comfortable retirement. It produces a woman of 60 with the knees of a woman of 80. There is a cruelty inside the arithmetic that is easy to miss. The better a servant was at the work, the longer she stayed in it. And the longer she stayed, the more completely the work used her up. Length of service, the very thing a great household said it valued, was also the thing that guaranteed she would leave it in a worse condition than she entered it. Nothing in the wage accounted for that. Nothing in the household books had a column for it, and even that competition assumed a document. Before an aging servant could be turned down for being slow, she had to be considered at all, and no respectable household in Britain would consider anybody without one particular piece of paper. The whole system turned on a single word, and the word belonged to the employer. Chapter 5. The word that decided every servant's future. A servant's whole working life ran on a single word, and that word was character, meaning the reference from the last employer. In modern terms, it was a reference, but the modern word is far too weak for what this thing did. A character was the spoken or written testimony of a previous employer about a servant's honesty, sobriety, temper, and competence. It was the primary means by which a household vetted anybody it was about to admit into its rooms, its bedrooms, and its silver cupboard. Without one, a servant did not get past the front step of a respectable house. The logic is easy to see from the employer's side. A stranger was being invited to live in the family's home, handle their possessions, dress their children, and lock their doors at night. There were no police checks. There was no register. There was only the word of the last household. And notice the direction the whole apparatus faced. Every safeguard in it protected the employer. The character told a family whether a servant could be trusted with the silver. Nothing in the system told a servant whether a household could be trusted with her old age, because no household was ever asked to answer for that. There was one further asymmetry, and it is the one that made the document so heavy to carry. A character was written or spoken about a servant and delivered to somebody else. She could be described by a woman she had served for a decade, to a stranger who would decide her next 10 years on the strength of it, in a letter or a conversation she had no part in. That system was formalized in law, and the law is worth knowing because of what it says about the anxieties of the people who wrote it. The servants' characters. Act of 1792, an act of the Parliament of Great Britain, came about after residents of London and Westminster petitioned Parliament. Their complaint was that servants were using false references to get places, and that the practice had been linked to a number of burglaries around the country. The Act made it a crime for a servant to forge a character or to misrepresent their employment history, and it also made it a crime for an employer to write a false one. Two facts about that statute are worth holding on to, because together they say something strange. The first is that in the whole life of the Act, only one successful prosecution was ever brought under it, and that prosecution came in 1910. More than a century of legislation, one conviction. The second is the date it left the statute book. The Servants' Characters Act was not repealed until 2008. The law governing servants' references outlived the world of servants by 100 years. So the criminal law barely touched the character system at all. What governed it was custom, and custom had teeth that the statute never needed. Look at how a servant actually found work. Some places came through registry offices, which were private employment agencies for domestic staff, taking a fee and matching servants to households. Some came through advertisements, in newspapers and in publications aimed at the trade. A great many came through recommendation, one household to another, and through the servants' own networks. A cousin who knew of a place, a former colleague, now in a bigger house. Every one of those routes ran through the character. The registry office wanted to know who would speak for her. The advertising household asked for it in the advertisement. The recommending friend was, in effect, offering a character of her own. And every one of those routes was tilted towards the young. The hiring market for domestic service was a market for strength and appearance. A household wanted a housemaid who could carry, a kitchen maid who could stand, a laundry maid who could lift. At the visible end, it wanted footmen of a certain height, because a matched pair behind a carriage was a piece of display, and the taller man was paid more for being taller. None of this was hidden. It was written into the advertisements, and every one of those routes could be closed by a single missing document. Think about what a servant without a character was actually looking at. The respectable households were shut. That left the rough end of the labour market, the work the census recorded under names like laundress and charwoman, the day work of scrubbing and washing for whoever would pay for an afternoon of it. No lodging came with it. No meals came with it. A woman who had eaten at a servants' hall table for 30 years now had to find rent. That drop happened in a single step. There was no intermediate rung between a place in a great house and casual work by the day, because the thing that connected them, the character, was exactly what she no longer had. For a young servant, the character was a ladder. Each place produced the document that reached the next place. A girl could climb from a farmhouse to a small manor to a great house on the strength of 3 good characters and a willingness to move. For an old servant, the same document became something else entirely. She had one employer to ask, usually after many years, and she was asking at the exact moment when her value in the market was falling. A prospective household weighing a woman of 60 against a girl of 20 had every reason to want reassurance, and only one place to get it, which puts an enormous amount of power in the hands of one person. Everything now depends on a question that sounds technical and turns out to be the whole of it. When a servant left a house after 30 years, was the employer actually obliged to give her a character at all? The answer was written down clearly in the legal guidance of the period, and it is the coldest sentence in this story. Chapter 6. When silence ended a lifetime of service. The cruelest power an employer held required no accusation, no reason, and no words at all. The Victorian legal position on characters was set out plainly for anybody who cared to look it up, and it said this: the law did not oblige anyone to give a character to a servant. It was perfectly competent to a master or a mistress to refuse one, without assigning any reason for the refusal. Read that twice, because the consequences run all the way through this film. A servant could give a household 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. She could raise their children, nurse their sick, keep their accounts, hold their keys, know every private thing about the family, and leave without a stain on her name. And on the day she left, the family could simply decline to write anything down, say nothing about why, and be entirely within the law. No accusation was required, no misconduct had to be alleged, no hearing existed, and nothing could be appealed, because there was nothing to appeal against. A refusal counted as an absence rather than a judgment, and an absence has no address to write to, and an absence was fatal. A servant who arrived at a respectable household with no character from her last place was, in practice, unemployable there. The household did not need to believe she had done anything wrong. It only needed to notice the gap, and to have 3 other applicants who did not have one. That is why silence was more powerful than dismissal. A dismissal for cause at least stated a charge, and a charge can be denied. Silence stated nothing, and could be answered by nothing. The law did have something to say about characters that were given, and it is worth understanding because it shows where the protection lay. If a character was given, the communication was privileged. That meant it was exempt from the law of libel and slander, provided it was given in good faith and without malicious intent to injure the servant. An employer could therefore write an honest bad character with no legal risk whatever. A servant who believed she had been injured by a false and malicious character could bring an action for damages, but the burden of proving both the falsity and the malice sat on her. So consider what a housemaid would have needed to do. Discover what had been said about her privately, in a letter or a conversation she was never shown. Prove it was untrue. Prove it was written with intent to harm. Fund a court case out of a wage of somewhere between £8 and £16 a year, and do all of that while unemployed, homeless, and without a reference. The protection existed on paper. In the life of an actual servant, it may as well not have. There is one more thing the silence took away, and it is the part that has no legal name. A dismissal with a reason at least leaves a person something to argue with. She can say the accusation was false. She can tell her sister what they claimed and deny it. She can carry a grievance, which is a kind of dignity. A refusal to speak leaves her nothing to hold. She walks away from 30 years without being told what those 30 years were judged to be worth, and she can never find out because the judgment was never uttered. A servant in that position had been placed outside the system without ever being charged with anything, and it required no malice at all. A household might refuse a character out of embarrassment or laziness or a vague sense that the parting had been awkward. The mechanism did not care about the motive. It only registered the absence. Now, apply the whole mechanism to the specific person this film is about, the servant who has grown old. She has reached the point where she cannot manage a full day. Perhaps she is slower on the stairs. Perhaps her hands shake carrying a tray, or she has begun to mishear an instruction, or her sight has gone for close work. The household notices. Nobody accuses her of anything, because there is nothing to accuse her of. The family has 3 options, and no obligation attached to any of them. They can keep her on in lighter duties, absorbing the cost of a servant who no longer earns her keep. They can pension her, or house her in a cottage on the estate, out of pure choice. Or they can end the arrangement and decide, quietly and without explanation, how warm a character to write, or whether to write one at all. If they choose the last, the machinery does the rest without any further cruelty being required. She leaves. She leaves the room too, because the room was theirs. She walks out into a hiring market that wants 20-year-olds, carrying either a thin reference or nothing. At that point, her 30 years of service have precisely the value of a stranger's. And this is the thing that costume drama has never quite conveyed, because it is undramatic. There is no shouting scene. There is no villain at the top of the stairs. There is a decision taken in a morning room by people who are not thinking about it very hard, and a whole life quietly loses its footing. The astonishing part is how rarely anybody wrote any of it down, which is why the one case that survives in detail from both sides, in the words of a man who became one of the most famous writers in the world, matters more than any statistic in this film. His mother was the housekeeper. The house was Uppark. And her ending came at almost exactly the age this whole system was built to ignore. Chapter 7. When Uppark had no more use for her. Sarah Wells came back to Uppark as housekeeper at 58, an unusually late age at which to start in the post. She was born in 1822, and she did not begin in service. She was apprenticed as a dressmaker and trained in hairdressing, which were skilled trades and better prospects than most girls of her background could expect. Those skills took her into a great house by the most desirable door available to a young woman as a lady's maid. A lady's maid dressed her mistress, cared for her clothes and her hair, travelled with her, and lived closer to the family than almost any other servant in the building. Sarah served in that post at Uppark, in the county of West Sussex, as a young woman. Then she left it, married, and raised a family in difficult circumstances at Bromley. Those middle years are the part of her life the house has no record of, and they are the reason for everything that followed. A woman who leaves service to marry leaves the ladder. Whatever standing she had built inside a household went with her, and it did not travel, which is why the year 1880 is remarkable. At 58, Sarah Wells came back to Uppark, to the same house she had served in as a girl, this time as housekeeper. 58 was an extraordinary age at which to be given that post. The housekeeper was the senior female servant, running the domestic side of the entire establishment and answering directly to the family. Sarah arrived as an old acquaintance of the place, with a gap of decades in the middle of her working life. She held the post for 12 or 13 years. The record disagrees about whether her service ended in 1892 or 1893, so the safest thing to say is that it ended in about 1892. By then she was approaching 70. Her employer was Frances Bullock, who was herself old and who was going deaf. So was Sarah. Two women in the same house, one giving instructions she could not hear the answers to, one receiving instructions she could not quite catch. Her son wrote about it afterwards, and his sentence is the most exact description of an ending of this kind in the language. They were two old deaf women at cross purposes, he wrote. The sentimental attachment between them evaporated in mutual irritation and left not a rack behind. Her son was Herbert George Wells, the novelist. Take that sentence apart, because there is a whole social system inside it. Start with the attachment, which he says was real. These two women had known each other for years. Sarah had come back to a house she had loved as a girl. There was affection in it, and something like continuity, and both of them appear to have wanted the arrangement to work. Then the irritation, which came from the deafness on both sides, and from age, and from the strain of running a large house with a body that had begun to fail. Sarah was hobbled by rheumatism, and her hearing was going. The work of a housekeeper is not carrying coal, but it is on the feet all day, up and down stairs, in and out of stores, in front of the family and the staff. And then the ending, which required no cruelty at all, only the exhaustion of goodwill between two people who were both too old for the arrangement. Now the part that matters most, and it is a single sentence of hard fact. By the time she reached 70, Sarah Wells had no prospect of having saved enough money for retirement. She had worked as a dressmaker, a lady's maid, a wife and mother in straitened circumstances, and a housekeeper in a country house. Decades of labour. At the end of it there was no fund, no annuity, no scheme, and no legal claim on anybody. There was one thing standing between Sarah Wells and the poor law, and it had nothing to do with her employer, her service, or her merit. She had a son who had made his own way in the world, and who could take her in. Her trade could not save her, and this is worth being exact about. She had been apprenticed as a dressmaker and trained in hairdressing, which were real skills with a market. But dressmaking is close work, done by eye and by hand, in a trade she had left decades earlier. A woman approaching 70, hobbled by rheumatism and unable to hear a customer, was in no position to take it up again. The one asset a woman of her generation could carry out of a house with her was the work of her hands, and age was in the process of taking that too. That is the whole of the margin. Her exit carried no disgrace, and her employer was an ordinary woman of her class. She left an ordinary post in ordinary circumstances at an ordinary age, and the only reason her name does not appear in a workhouse register is a biographical accident. Multiply that thought across 1.5 million people, and the shape of the problem appears. Every single one of them had a version of this moment waiting. Whether it ended in a son's spare room, an estate cottage, an almshouse, or an institution, depended almost entirely on facts that had nothing to do with how well they had done the job. Frances Bullock deserves a word, too, since it is easy to make her the villain, and the record will not support it. She was an elderly woman herself, deaf, running an inherited house with a servant she could no longer communicate with. She had no legal duty of any kind towards Sarah Wells's old age, and nothing in her upbringing would have suggested she had a moral one either. The system did not ask her to be cruel. It simply never asked her to be anything. That was the point of it. Which raises the obvious objection, and it is the strongest one in the whole story. Some houses did provide. Some old servants were kept, pensioned, and given a roof for life. So what separated the households that looked after their people from the households that did not? Nothing in the law, nothing in the contract, only the character of the family, and one of the greatest estates in England kept the ledgers to prove it. Chapter 8. The cottage that only some of them got. Some landed families did provide for their old servants, which is the fact that makes everything else in this story worse. There was a recognised tradition among landed employers of looking after staff in their old age. It took a familiar physical form. An old servant would be housed in a cottage on the estate, sometimes rent-free, sometimes with fuel and a piece of garden ground, and sometimes with a small pension paid alongside it. For a working-class family in Victorian Britain, that arrangement was close to unimaginable. Most working people had nothing of the kind available to them at any point in their lives. A cottage and a small income for the rest of your days, in exchange for your years, was a form of security that the industrial working class simply did not encounter. And the great estates kept records of it, which is how it can be said with confidence rather than sentiment. At Chatsworth, the household accounts of the Dukes of Devonshire include distinct groups of accounts for pensions and annuities. 2 runs of them survive with dates attached, one covering 1825 to 1828, another covering 1855 to 1858. An annuity, in the language of the period, is a sum paid every year for the rest of a person's life. Those account groups establish something important. Provision for old servants was administratively normal in the greatest households. It had its own bookkeeping. Somebody sat down every year and wrote the names and the payments. What those accounts do not establish, and this film will not pretend otherwise, is how many people were on them, how much they received, or what a servant had to do to qualify. Those figures sit in the archive, and the sources behind this film do not contain them. Any number quoted for the Chatsworth pension list is a guess, but the shape of the thing is clear enough without the figures, and the shape is the point. There is a further fragility in it that the accounts alone will not show. A pension paid by a family depends on the family. Fortunes fell. Heirs inherited debts and looked for economies, and an old woman in a cottage who no longer did any work is the easiest economy in any estate book. Nothing prevented a successor from ending an arrangement his father had made. Estate provision was a gift. It carried no legal force. It was concentrated in the very largest and richest households, which employed only a fraction of the country's servants. It rewarded long, unbroken service, visible loyalty, and above all the good opinion of the family. It could be reduced, or ended, or simply never offered, and there was no court in England where a servant could argue about it. Compare that with what the same country was doing for a different kind of servant in the same years. The Superannuation Act of 1859 entitled civil servants who had served 10 years or more, and who could no longer work through old age or infirmity to retire on a fraction of their final salary. A right, written into statute, enforceable. So from 1859 onwards, a clerk in a government office had something a housekeeper who had run a ducal household for 30 years did not have, and would never have. Britain understood the idea of deferred pay perfectly well. It chose where to apply it. Where the employer gave nothing, the next layer was charity. And the numbers there are worth hearing carefully, because they are generous and hopeless at the same time. Victorian London's almshouse foundations were purpose-built for exactly this population. Take one of them. Amyas's almshouses provided 8 homes for poor, respectable women in reduced circumstances. The homes were rent-free. They came with coals, with medical attendance, and with £25 a year. The same foundation also funded 16 annuities of £30 each for out-pensioners, meaning recipients who lived in their own accommodation outside the almshouse walls. Those are real numbers, and per person they are handsome. £25 to £30 a year was more than most housemaids in Britain ever earned in wages. A woman who got one of those places was better off in her old age than she had been in her working life. Now the arithmetic that undoes it. 8 places and 16 annuities, 24 people, against a national servant population of more than 1.5 million. The pattern repeats across the charitable landscape. In 1863, 6 people founded the United Kingdom Beneficent Association, with the stated aim of preventing destitution by providing those in poverty with a small regular income for life. That founding purpose describes the hole in the system with complete precision, and the fact that 6 private individuals had to invent an institution to fill it tells you the state and the great houses had left it open. The organisation still exists, under a different name, which is a thread this film will pick up at the end. So the picture at this point in the story is complete, and it is a picture of a lottery. A servant's old age depended on which house she had served in, how large its fortune was, whether the family kept a pension list, whether her face was known and liked, whether a charitable foundation had a vacancy, and whether she had children who could take her in. None of those things could be earned. All of them could be missed. And in the house that treated its servants better than almost any other house in Britain, in the house that painted their portraits and wrote poems about them, an old woman was still working at 87. Chapter 9. Erddig painted its servants and kept them working. In 1791, the squire of a Welsh house commissioned 6 portraits of his servants and wrote a poem to go with each one. The house is Erddig, in Denbighshire, in northeast Wales, and there is nothing else quite like it in Britain. The York family who owned it did something no other landed family thought to do at that scale. They documented their staff, deliberately and continuously, beginning in 1791 and carrying on for generations. Philip York, the first, commissioned a set of 6 servant portraits from a painter called John Walters of Denbigh. He also began the custom of writing doggerel verse about each servant, verses later published under the title Crude Ditties. Portraits of servants, painted properly, on canvas, and hung in the house. That is a genuinely strange act for an 18th century landowner, and the film should sit with it rather than rush past it. The servants themselves could never have afforded such a thing. The commission came from the man who employed them, about people whose entire social function was to be unnoticed. The most famous of them is a woman named Jane Ebbrell. She was born in 1706. She came into the household from the London house of John Mellor in Bloomsbury Square, brought to Erddig when Mellor acquired the estate earlier in the 18th century. She stayed for the rest of her life and served Philip York I faithfully. The painting shows her in front of her lodgings, with her broom and her mop beside her, holding a piece of paper. The paper is her poem, and the words on it can be read inside the painting itself. The caption gives her age and her occupation. Spider brusher, aged 87. Her job, by that point, was brushing spiders off the ceilings. Look at the composition for a moment, because whoever arranged it understood what they were doing. She stands in front of her lodgings, meaning the place she lived, on the estate, in old age. The broom and the mop are beside her, so the work is in the picture. And she holds the poem, which means the painting contains its own caption, written by the man who paid for it. A portrait of a housemaid at her own door, with her tools and her verse, in 1791. Now, the detail that makes Erddig the most complicated house in this entire story, and it comes from the account recorded at Erddig itself, rather than from any independent document. Philip York wanted to reward Jane Ebbrell with a pensioned retirement. By that account, she flatly refused it, and carried on earning her keep as a spider brusher, flicking away any stray spiders she spotted, until she died at the age of 87. There are 3 ways to read that refusal, and the honest position is that nobody can be certain which is right. The first is pride. She had worked since childhood, in a world where the word pauper was a description of moral failure as much as of poverty. Taking money for doing nothing may have felt like the beginning of that descent, whatever the squire called it. The second is attachment. In her own mind, Erddig was her house, in every sense except the legal one. She had lived in it for most of a century. A pension meant leaving the working life of the place, and possibly leaving the rooms, and there was nothing else in the world she belonged to. The third reading is the coldest, and to a modern ear, the most persuasive. Jane Ebbrell may have understood exactly what a pension was worth in a house where she no longer worked. A wage for labour done is a transaction. A pension granted by kindness is a gift, and gifts can be reconsidered by heirs, by wives, by a family in difficulty. As long as she was useful, she was safe. All 3 are interpretation. What is documented is the refusal and the spiders themselves deserve a moment, because the job is stranger than it sounds. Brushing spiders off ceilings is real work in a large old house, and it is also, transparently, work that has been found for somebody. A woman of 87 was never going to carry coal or scrub a floor again. Somebody in that household looked at what she could still do, which was walk slowly through rooms with a long brush, and made it into a post with a name. That is what a kept servant looked like in practice. A lighter job, invented to fit a body that had worn out in the family's service, and a place at the table for as long as it lasted. The tradition around her ran for generations. The Yorks went on recording their servants long after Philip York I commissioned those first 6 canvases, and the verses went on being written. A family that could have spent its money on more portraits of itself chose, repeatedly, to spend some of it on the people in the service wing. There is no way to know what Jane Ebbrell made of being painted. She could not have commissioned such a thing in 100 lifetimes of her own wages. The picture exists because her employer wanted it to, which means even the memorial was a gift rather than a right. That is the pattern of this entire story, compressed into one canvas. Erddig matters to this story for one reason above all. It represents the very best that the system could produce. At Erddig, servants were painted and named and versified and remembered by people who did not have to bother. The house treated them, by the standards of the 18th and 19th centuries, extraordinarily well. Their portraits still hang there. And even in that house, an 87-year-old woman was still working, and the alternative on offer was a favour rather than a right. If the kindest household in Britain produced that outcome, the outcome in the average household hardly needs describing. But the average is where the story now has to go, because there was a much faster way for a service career to end than growing old. It could end in a single morning, on nothing more than an accusation, and the same document did the same work. Chapter 10. When an accusation ended it all at once. A career did not have to end in old age, because a single accusation could close it at any age at all. 2 women make the point, and both of them are recoverable only because a historian went looking in the service archives of country houses where almost nobody looks. Their stories were reconstructed by Tessa Bowes in her book, The Housekeeper's Tale. That phrase, the service archives, is worth holding on to. A country house archive is usually studied for the family, the estate papers, the correspondence, the building accounts. The papers concerning the staff sit in the same muniment room, in the same boxes, and were for a very long time considered the dull part. Bowes went to the dull part, and two of the women who came out of it belong in this film. Both ran great households. Both were dismissed. Neither ending was recorded anywhere the public could see it until somebody opened the boxes. Start at Erddig, the same house with the portraits and the poems, a century after Jane Ebbrell. Ellen Penketh was cook and housekeeper there from 1902 to 1907. Her employers were Philip York II and his young and inexperienced wife Louisa. 5 years in the post, running the kitchen and the household of a family that prided itself on its treatment of servants. She left under a cloud. She was accused of theft. What happened to her afterwards, and precisely how the accusation was resolved, sits in Bowes's research and beyond the reach of this film's sources, so nothing more will be claimed about it here. What can be said is the shape of the moment. A woman of standing in the household, 5 years into a senior post, accused and gone. Now go back 80 years to a house of far greater wealth. Dorothy Doar was housekeeper at Trentham Hall in Staffordshire from 1820 to 1832. Her employers were the first Duke and Duchess of Sutherland, among the wealthiest landowners in Britain. 12 years in charge of the domestic side of one of the great houses of the country. She was dismissed. She too was accused of theft. And in Bowes's reconstruction, the catalyst for her dismissal was a second pregnancy. The record gives the catalyst and stops there. So what follows is interpretation rather than evidence. A housekeeper's authority over the female staff of a great house rested on her standing as much as on her competence, and a pregnancy could unsettle that standing in ways the household did not have to explain. What became of Dorothy Doar after 1832 is, again, beyond what can responsibly be said here. The record of her dismissal survives. The record of her life afterwards does not, or at least has not, reached this film, and inventing an ending for her would be exactly the sin this channel exists to correct. But put the two cases beside each other, and the mechanism shows itself with total clarity. Ellen Penketh and Dorothy Doar were senior women in good posts, in the prime of their working lives, with their strength and their hearing and their knees intact. Their careers ended anyway, in a morning, on an accusation, at the employer's word, which shows that the lever this film has been describing had nothing to do with age at all. Age was simply the most common reason for pulling it. The lever was the structure, and the structure had 3 parts. A servant lived in the employer's house, held her position at the employer's pleasure, and could only get another position with the employer's testimony. Those 3 facts, stacked, meant that any employer at any moment could end a servant's working life for a reason of their own choosing, or for no stated reason whatever. An accusation of theft did it in a morning. Old age did it more slowly, and with better manners. There is a further point buried in Ellen Penketh's case, and it goes to the heart of what a senior servant actually handled. A cook and housekeeper ran the domestic side of a household, which is a position built entirely on the family's confidence, and a position of that kind can be destroyed by the withdrawal of confidence alone. A young and inexperienced mistress, looking with fresh eyes at arrangements that had run on habit for years, is a situation that can end a career without anybody needing to be a thief. That reading is interpretation, and the record at Erddig is thin enough that it stays interpretation. This film cannot say what happened in that kitchen at Erddig, and it will not pretend to. What it can say is that a woman who had run the place for 5 years left it under a cloud, and that the cloud was enough. And notice what the accusation did to the character. A woman dismissed on suspicion of theft was, for practical purposes, finished in service. She could not produce a character from her last place. She could not explain the gap. Even where nothing was ever proved, the absence spoke, and it spoke loudest in exactly the households she needed to reach. The same silence that met the old servant met the accused one, and it did the same work. 12 years running the domestic side of a Sutherland house ended on that, and the record of what the household said to her or wrote about her afterwards has not survived in anything this film can quote. So the population this film is following is larger than the elderly. It includes everybody the system spat out for any reason, at any age, without recourse. Add them together across the Victorian decades, across a working population of 1.5 million people, and the numbers become very large indeed. Which raises the question the whole film has been walking towards. Where did they all go? There is an answer, and it comes from one of the most rigorous social investigations of the 19th century. Chapter 11. The institution that took them in the end. Charles Booth counted the old people of England and Wales in 1894 and found nearly 3 in every 10 on the poor law. In June of 1894, Charles Booth published a study called The Aged Poor in England and Wales. It measured the condition of old people across the country at a time when almost everything said about the poor in Britain was assertion, and the figures in it are the reason this chapter can be written at all. His findings ran as follows, in his own units. In the early 1890s, approximately 29% of people over the age of 65 in England and Wales were receiving some form of poor law relief. About 8.5% were receiving indoor relief, which meant they were inside a workhouse. About 19% were receiving outdoor relief, which meant payments or goods received while living in their own accommodation. And in many districts, the rate of pauperism among those aged 65 and above ran to more than 50%. Say those numbers slowly. Nearly 3 in every 10 old people in England and Wales, in the richest country in the world at the height of its empire, were on relief. In some districts, more than 1 in 2. One caution belongs here, and this film will not blur it. Booth counted all old people, not servants specifically. What proportion of the aged poor had spent their lives in domestic service is not established by the sources behind this film, and no honest programme can put a figure on it. What his numbers do establish is the background against which every servant's old age was calculated. This was the ordinary fate of ordinary working people who reached 65 in Victorian Britain, and the servants of the great houses were ordinary working people with a better address for a while. Now the place itself. The workhouse was a large institutional building run by a local board of guardians and paid for by the rates, which were the local property taxes. It was deliberately made unpleasant, on the theory that relief, which was too comfortable, would attract people who could otherwise support themselves. An inmate arriving at the gate surrendered their own clothing and was issued a uniform, to be worn for the whole of their stay. That detail lands differently for a servant than for anybody else. She had spent her working life in clothing that announced her position, bought out of her own wage or partly supplied by the family, and kept decent because appearance was part of the job. At the workhouse gate, the clothing went into a store and a uniform came out, identical to everybody else's, and the last visible difference between one old woman and another disappeared. Then came the sorting. Men were separated from women. The able-bodied were separated from the infirm. A husband and wife of 50 years might be admitted through the same door and see each other rarely afterwards. For a woman who had spent her life inside a household that ran on rank, ritual, and the precise placing of every person in it, the workhouse was the same principle turned inside out. Sorted, uniformed, addressed by an official, and stripped of the one thing service had actually given her, which was a position. Conditions for the elderly did soften towards the end of the period, and the film should say so. In 1900, the local government board recommended that elderly inmates be granted certain privileges which could not be accorded to every inmate of the workhouse. Some workhouses created dedicated accommodation so that aged married couples need not be split. At St Marylebone, the aged married couples' quarters consisted of 10 little tenements for as many Darbys and Jones, one room to one couple, Darby and Joan being the period expression for a devoted old married pair. 10 rooms in one institution in 1900. It was a real improvement, and it was arithmetically trivial, and both of those things are true at once. The 19% deserve a moment of their own, because outdoor relief is the part of this system that modern viewers picture least clearly. Outdoor relief meant payments or goods received while living in your own accommodation rather than a place inside the institution. It kept a roof over an old woman's head, and it kept her out of the uniform. So the 19% were the lucky ones, in the sense that they slept in their own beds. They were still, administratively, on the poor law. The census takers had a word for people in that condition, and they wrote it down beside the names of former servants, laundresses, and charwomen: paupers. In a society that measured people by their independence, that word did real damage to the old. And Booth's 8.5%, the ones indoors, had lost even that. So set the 4 possible endings side by side, which is where this part of the story has been going. An old servant could be kept on in lighter work inside the house, as Jane Ebbrell was at Erddig. She could be pensioned or given a cottage on the estate, the kind of provision whose bookkeeping survives at Chatsworth. She could be taken in by family, as Sarah Wells was by her son, or she could fall back on the poor law into outdoor relief or through the workhouse gate. How often each of those happened to former servants specifically, nobody knows, and this film will not invent a distribution. But the 29% is the shadow lying across all of it. Whatever the exact proportion, the 4th ending was not rare. It was the statistically ordinary outcome for old working people in Victorian England, and there was nothing in a servant's working life that exempted her from it. The country argued about this for decades. Booth's evidence landed in 1894. 2 royal commissions examined the condition of the aged poor in the mid-1890s, and the argument was always the same one. Was poverty in old age a moral failure or a social fact? It took another 14 years for Parliament to answer, and the answer came with a condition attached that will sound very familiar. Chapter 12. 5 shillings a week at 70. Britain finally built a floor beneath old age in 1908, and then set it lower than a housemaid's wage. The Old Age Pensions Act of 1908 created the first state pension in British history. It was non-contributory, meaning that the recipient had never paid into anything. The first pensions were paid in January of 1909. The terms ran as follows: 5 shillings a week for a single person aged 70 or over, 7 shillings and 6pence a week for a married couple. The full rate went to those with an income below £21 a year, reducing on a sliding scale for incomes between £21 and £31 and 10 shillings. Applicants had to pass a character test, and only those of good character qualified. Disqualifications included habitual failure to work when able, deliberate impoverishment in order to qualify, imprisonment, and conviction under the Inebriates Act, which dealt with habitual drunkenness. And a person was disqualified from receiving the pension while in receipt of poor relief. Now measure that against the story this film has been telling. 5 shillings a week comes to £13 a year. A Chatsworth housemaid in the 1811 survey earned £11 a year, plus roughly £3 of sugar allowance. So the pension that finally arrived a century later was worth about what one great house had paid a young woman for cleaning its grates. It began at 70, which many servants never reached, and which lay years beyond the age at which the work had already become impossible. Sarah Wells was about 70 when Uppark ended, and the Act was 16 years away. It excluded anybody currently on poor relief, so the servant who had already fallen into the workhouse got nothing until she left it. And it applied a character test. That is the detail that closes the circle of this entire story. The same word that governed a servant's working life at the hiring stage, the word that decided whether she could get another place, the word an employer could withhold without giving a reason, was written into the statute that finally governed the end of it. At the beginning of her life, she needed a character to get work. At the end of it, she needed a character to get 5 shillings. The disqualifications repay a closer look because they show what Parliament believed it was guarding against. A person could be refused the pension for having habitually failed to work when able, for having deliberately made themselves poor in order to qualify, for having been in prison, for having been convicted under the Inebriates Act, which was the legislation dealing with habitual drunkenness. Every one of those clauses describes a suspicion about the poor, rather than a fact about them. And then the last one, which is the cruelest piece of administration in the whole statute. A person was disqualified from receiving or continuing to receive the pension while they were in receipt of poor relief. Follow that through for the woman this film has been describing. She has already fallen. She is in the workhouse, or drawing a few shillings a week from the parish, because the work ended 8 years before the pension age. She is exactly the person the Act was written for, and she is exactly the person the Act excluded, for as long as she remained in the condition that made her need it. The floor was built above her head. Britain had been arguing about this for a very long time by then. Booth's evidence landed in 1894. 2 royal commissions examined the condition of the aged poor in the middle of that decade. The question underneath all of it never changed, and it was moral rather than economic. Were these people unfortunate, or were they culpable? The Act of 1908 answered both at once. It conceded that old age poverty was a social fact, and then it wrote a character test into the concession, none of which makes the Act small. It was one of the foundations of modern social welfare in the United Kingdom, part of the programme of liberal reforms between 1906 and 1914. And for a great many old people, it was the difference between the workhouse and a room of their own. It was a real flaw, and a low one, and it arrived roughly 2 generations too late for the women this film has been following. Jane Ebbrell had been dead for over a century. Dorothy Doar had been dismissed 76 years earlier. Sarah Wells had walked out of Uppark 16 years before. The world that produced them was already ending by then, and what it left behind is a scattering of paintings, ledgers, and empty rooms. Chapter 13. What the archives kept and what vanished. The paintings survive, the wage books survive, the houses survive, and the endings of almost everybody in them do not. Erddig stands today in the care of the National Trust, the charity that holds many of Britain's historic houses for the public. The portraits are still there. The verses are still there. A visitor can stand in front of Jane Ebbrell, aged 87, with her broom and her mop and her poem in her hand, and read what her employer wrote about her. No other house in Britain offers quite that. Erddig is the closest thing this country has to a monument to the servant relationship, and it exists because one family in 1791 decided that the people who cleaned their rooms were worth a painter's fee. Uppark is also in the care of the National Trust, and Sarah Wells's own portrait survives in the Trust's collection. The housekeeper was painted, and the painting outlasted her. The house is reported to have suffered a serious fire in 1989, after which it was restored. Chatsworth holds the deepest archive of the three. The Devonshire collection contains the household accounts, including those separate groups of pension and annuity accounts from 1825 to 1828 and from 1855 to 1858. The estate has also compiled a database of its servants and staff reaching back to 1700, built with the help of doctoral students from the University of Sheffield and published in part. That database is the single most hopeful thing in this story. It is a great house going back through its own paperwork to name the people it employed, 300 years after it started employing them. Trentham Hall, where Dorothy Doar was housekeeper, is reported to have been largely demolished in the early 20th century. The gardens are open to the public today, and the house she ran is a foundation and a memory. The institution, founded in 1863 by 6 people to give the poor a small regular income for life, is still going. It became the Royal United Kingdom Beneficent Association under Royal Charter, and since 2005 it has been called Independent Age. It still supports older people. There is a direct, unbroken line from a Victorian charitable committee, formed to plug a hole the great houses had left open, to an organisation working in Britain today. Many of the Victorian almshouse foundations also survive, still providing charitable housing to the old. The buildings that took in 8 poor, respectable women in reduced circumstances, rent-free, with coals and medical attendants, are in many cases still doing a version of the same job. Erddig keeps something the others do not, which is the service side of the house itself. The ranges where the work was done are there, along with the portraits of the people who did it, in the same building. A visitor can walk from the painted face of a servant to the room she worked in. That combination is almost unique in Britain, and it exists by accident of one family's habit. So the buildings are in remarkably good order. What has gone is the other half. The census returns survive, the wage books survive, and between them they can name a housemaid, date her arrival, and record her wage. What they very rarely do is follow her out of the door. For the great majority of the 1.5 million, the last line of the wage book is the last line there is. The work of the historian Tessa Bowes matters for exactly this reason. She went into the neglected service archives of the stately homes, the papers nobody had bothered with, and reconstructed the working lives of individual housekeepers from them. Dorothy Doar at Trentham, Ellen Penketh at Erddig. Women who had been a name in a ledger became people with a case, a household, a downfall, and a date, which proves something worth sitting with. These lives are recoverable. The evidence exists in wage books and household accounts and census columns and service archives, in cardboard boxes in muniment rooms across Britain. It is simply that for 150 years, almost nobody went looking. And the reason is the same principle that runs through everything in this film. The people who kept these houses were designed to be unnoticed while they lived. When the houses opened to the public, the visitors were shown the staterooms, the portraits of the family, the china, and the beds that royalty had slept in. The service wing was the part you walked past on the way to the tea room. Habits of attention outlast the households that formed them. A hierarchy that decided which people were worth looking at in 1880 was still quietly deciding which papers were worth reading in 1980. That has begun to change in the archives at Chatsworth, on the walls at Erddig, in the boxes Tessa Bowes opened. It changed late. And when somebody does go looking, the search usually ends at the same place. One word, in one column, on one page of a census return. Chapter 14. The single word left in the column. In the census returns of Victorian Britain, there is a word that does the work of an obituary for a very large number of people. Formerly. Formerly a domestic servant. Formerly a laundress. Formerly a charwoman. Written down by an enumerator who walked the street and asked and had no column for what came next. It records that the work stopped. It records nothing about what replaced it. It says nothing about who was feeding her, or who owned the roof over her head, or whether there was one. That word is the ending for most of the people in this film, and it is the reason this film had to be about a rule instead of a house. Because the finding at the bottom of all of this is stranger than cruelty would have been. The great houses of Britain had no policy for old servants. There was no scheme to be underfunded, no promise to be broken, no rule that anybody violated. What happened to a woman at the end of 40 years depended entirely on the personal decency of the individual family she happened to serve. And personal decency is a weather system, not a structure. The same social class, in the same decades, under the same law, produced Philip York offering a pension to a housemaid of 87, and produced households that turned out women of 70 with no character and nowhere to go. It produced a family who paid a painter to record a spider brusher, and families who could not be troubled to write 4 lines on a sheet of paper. Both outcomes were legal. Both were normal. Neither was owed. And that is a harder finding to sit with than villainy would have been. A villain can be named and blamed. A cruel policy can be repealed. What these households had was an absence where a policy should have been, and an absence cannot be argued with, or reformed, or even properly resented. It can only be filled by somebody choosing to fill it, one old woman at a time, in one house at a time, for as long as the family felt like it. Some of them chose. Most of the record simply does not say, which is its own kind of answer. That is the real architecture behind the green baize door. Not the bells, not the backstairs, not the concealed corridors, but the quiet arrangement by which a nation's largest workforce was given everything it needed and no claim on any of it. They were hired for their strength. They were kept while the strength lasted. They were released into a world that had made no arrangement for them at all. Think about what these houses were for. They were built to outlast the people who built them, and a great many of them did exactly that. Stone, oak, lid, 300 years of continuity, a family name carved above a door so that strangers in another century would know who had stood there. They were kept standing by people treated as consumable, hired young for their backs and their knees, used until the backs and the knees were finished, and then handed back to a country that had prepared nothing for them. The house on the hill is the monument. The women who kept it warm are a line in a wage book, and then a word in a census column, and then nothing. Herbert George Wells found the words for it without meaning to, writing about his own mother and the old woman she served. The attachment between them, he said, evaporated in mutual irritation and left not a rack behind. Not a rack behind. Nothing left standing. Nothing to show for it. That is what the record does with almost every one of these women, and it is why a single census word has to serve as the memorial for so many of them. So come back to the beginning, to a morning in about 1892, in a house in West Sussex. A woman of about 70 comes down the back stairs of Uppark for the last time. She is deaf. Her knees are ruined. She has run this household since 1880, and she is leaving it with a box that holds everything she owns. The house stands there still, open to visitors, in the care of the National Trust. Her portrait survives in the Trust's collection. The rooms she kept are still warm. She is walking out of the only place she had, into a century that would build its floor beneath old age 16 years too late for her. Thank you for staying with her to the end. Subscribe if you want more of the people these houses were built to hide. And tell me in the comments, when an employer turned an old servant out with nothing, was that simply the age they lived in, or was it a choice? And whose side are you on?